everybody. Excited to have you on today onto the podcast. And boy, we got a treat here. Doug Pallister actually referred Colonel Russ Kotwal to me. He served as a battalion surgeon for 375 for 3 deployments, the regimental surgeon, and spent a total of 9 years in Ranger Regiment. He has 2 joint service medals for valor and 2 combat jumps, which is going to be interesting, and I'm excited to talk about that because there's not probably very many people in the medical community that have 2 combat jumps, so that's pretty amazing. But also he's credited with some of the biggest changes that we made in the medical community, and he's actually the individual that a lot of people source as a person that was pivotal in that process. So, sir, it's an honor to have you on Legends today. How you doing?
Oh, Mike, thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah. So let's just let's start at the beginning. I know you have an interesting story even prior to the military, but what made you decide to get into the medical field?
So first off, you had mentioned Doug Pallister, and Doug Pallister having referred me to you. I'm gonna not answer your question, and I'm gonna say something about Doug.
Okay.
And so he said something to me that was very profound, and Doug and I had hung out on several different deployments and did several things together. And what we're concerned about for a while was that there were a lot of folks that felt entitled to certain things through the years, especially as these as younger folks were coming back into the organization, and they felt entitled to this or that or whatever else. And one of the things that you used to always say is that in this age of entitlement, the only thing you're entitled to is good leadership. And so for me, as I think about the Rangers and I think about the Ranger Regiment and I think about what we're all about, I tell you, that's all I've received through the years is good, not only good, but great leadership through the Rangers. So going back in time, so my story actually began, at least for Rangers, in the 1980s, early 1980s. And so my father was in the military for 24, 25 years. He was in San Antonio at the time on an assignment. And so I was here in Texas and looking at different colleges. I ended up going to a place called Texas A&M University. And Texas A&M University, it fit who I was and my personality, my character. I went into the Corps Cadets there. And what was prominent about it is that and one of the presidents of Texas A&M University was a guy by the name of James Earl Rudder. And he was also the commander of 2nd Ranger Battalion.
Wow, that's a big name. Yeah.
Yes, big name. And there was an organization here called Rudder's Rangers as well. And so Rangers was very prominent. The history of General Rudder was very prominent. He was class of 1932 out of Texas A&M University. And that's what steered me towards my interest in the Ranger Regiment. And then also learning about multiple Medal of Honor recipients that had been here at Texas A&M University, and that others that were affiliated with Rangers, and just realizing their mission, realizing their character and their personality, had felt more like who I was, and that's what I thought about when I was here at A&M. Wasn't sure that I wanted to go into medicine at that time, but I had a strong leaning towards medicine, and so I graduated with a degree in public health. And went straight into the military, uncertain of what I wanted to do. And initially wanted to fly medevac. Unfortunately, my eyes couldn't support that, and so my vision wasn't as appropriate at that time to be able to branch into that. And so I got branched into medical service and was assigned to the 25th ID out in Hawaii. While I was in basic, I called out to the 25th ID, found out who the battalion commander was, which is a guy by the name of Tom Hill, and asked him, gave a good argument for why I should be sent to Ranger School, and that was back in 1986. And sure enough, he made that happen, and I got a slot, and I went to Ranger School in '86, and that was the start of my Ranger career, if you will. As I served at the 25th ID, specifically the 135 Cacti and the 427 Wolfhounds, I felt like that I really enjoyed working in around combat arms and infantry and light infantry. It just strengthened my desire to make it to the Ranger Regiment. And at some point in my career, I also had a strong desire, as I was working with medical platoon as a medical platoon leader, to learn more about medicine. And so I applied to medical school and was accepted to several different medical schools, hard choice but between all of them, but ultimately ended up at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences up in Bethesda, Maryland. It was a military medical school in line with what I wanted to do, and that I wanted to be equally in the military and equally a physician. I wanted to be a military physician, not just a physician that happened to be in the military. And so as a result, had some great training and instruction there at the Uniformed Services University, and then went from there into an initial residency. So I'm talking a lot right now. Was there any questions on anything that I've said thus far?
No, it's good. I mean, it's all stuff that, we've been talking about and asking about, how you kind of found yourself in that field. The one question I was going to ask, is in Ranger School, were you working with, when you went through Ranger School, was there a lot of guys from Ranger Battalion, with your element?
There was, and matter of fact, there was a private that you may know his name, Oros. You ever heard of him? So private or Ranger Oros became Command Sergeant Major Oros later on. And so by the time that I got to the regiment, years in the future, he was already a senior NCO, and our paths were crossing again. And so yes, there was. I went there in the summer. There were a lot of folks from the Ranger Regiment that were there, and just super exciting to work with them at that time. Even though it took me a while to get to the regiment in future years. So,
but what is it? Something going to Ranger Regiment? It was something that never was, escaping your mind. It was always in the back of your mind that you wanted to go to the 75th Ranger Regiment this whole time.
I did, and well, I mean, so probably because of Rudder and learning more about the history of the Rangers through the years, that I felt like, yes, this was a group of individuals that fit my character and personality, and that's where I wanted to go. So initially, Medical Service Corps, there weren't any openings, there weren't any positions for Medical Service Corps in the Ranger Regiment, and that would change ultimately once I became a regimental surgeon in the future. Between me and my senior medic, we created positions for Medical Service Corps officers so that they could start in the organization and learn about the organization and do great things in other places. But there were positions for physicians. There are few. There are only one per battalion and one at the regiment, and so that's very few positions. But ultimately, I still had that in the back of my mind that I wanted to get there. Yes.
All right. So, what year did you go to RAS2 to go to 375?
So after medical school, I went through a residency in family medicine, and I was there with another guy that I went through medical school with. His name was Chris Pappas, and Chris Pappas, after the intern year, he went over to 3rd Ranger Battalion and served there from 97 to 99. And then I kept in contact with him and told him my desire to go to 3rd Ranger Battalion or to go to the regiment. Didn't matter what battalion for me. I just wanted to be part of the organization. And so kept in contact with him, talked with non-commissioned officers from the regiment during that time frame, connected with several officers that were also in the regiment since I was there doing my residency in family medicine at Martin Army Community Hospital at Fort Benning, and then went to RASP in, or I guess ROTC back then, in 1999, and so in early in 1999. Great challenge, enjoyed it a lot. And then from there was assigned there that summer, and right off the bat we went off on an deployment as we went to Germany for our first training deployment. Yeah.
So what was your rope experience like? Because you've been at this point, you'd been in the conventional Army for quite a while, and you'd always had in kind of the back of your mind these Rangers and Rudder and all this different kind of stuff, and you were going through rope. What was kind of the feeling, and what was what was that like?
Well, I mean, believe it or not, I was in pretty good shape back then. I was young, in shape, and so amongst my medical colleagues, I felt like I was doing pretty good.
Right.
I could keep up with all my colleagues. Then I go to this assessment and find out that, oh man, I was nowhere close to some of the phenomenally gifted individuals that were out there.
Genetic freaks, yeah.
Yes, they were, and so just their ability I mean, natural God-given ability. And so it was a pleasure to work with them, but I didn't feel like I was on the same level as some of these individuals that truly were physically talented. Yes.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that stood out to me.
So I found in another interview, and I know we'll talk about, life in the Ranger Regiment, post 9/11, where we'll kind of get into a lot of the stuff that I wanted to talk about. But you had an interesting story about delivering a baby on 9/11, and I'd love for you to tell that story.
Okay. So before I get there, what I will say is that so from 99 to 2001, what I did was I established a Ranger clinic up at Martin Army, and so yes, I would see folks at the hospital, but that weren't in the regiment, but established it primarily to create slots for Rangers and Ranger family members. And so as a family medicine physician, I followed folks for various conditions, including pregnancies, and really enjoyed doing that. I think all said and done, I may have delivered 150 babies, and my honor to do so for those that were part of the Ranger Regiment. And all those babies from those years, I mean, they're all in their late teens and 20s now, and so they're older. But,
hold on, I want to. We need to actually find that list of all the babies you delivered and find out if any of them are a Ranger Regiment, so that they were delivered by a Ranger. Yeah, delivered by a Ranger spouse and brought into this world by a Ranger. We need to find that out, because that's actually that would be a really interesting thing to find.
Well, I haven't thought about that, but yes, it would be very, very much so. Yes, but then I guess after a couple of years of doing that, then in 2001, I got a call early in the morning from one of those wives, that phenomenal lady. Her name was Mrs. J, and she was the wife of one of the mortarmen and 3rd Ranger Battalion, a guy that had gone on many exercises with and worked with, and was a pleasure knowing him. And so she called me at about 5 o'clock in the morning. It was a Tuesday morning, and said, "Hey, I'm contracting. I think this is the time." And I said, "Well, why don't you meet me up in Martin Army within the hour?" And so she did. Both got there about an hour later. It was about 6, 7 in the morning. I did a cervical check. Sure enough, she was dilating, and saw the monitors, and she was contracting on a regular basis. And so went ahead and admitted her, and went back to the call room. And at that time, I was finishing up a book that I was reading at the time. It's called "We Were Soldiers Once and Young," written by Hal Moore. And so reading up about everything that he had to say, and finished that up. Came back out of the call room at about 9 o'clock just to check on Mrs. J and see how she was doing. And was doing another cervical check. She was progressing fine, doing very, very well. And there was a TV on in the room, and it was showing some distracting things as both of us were looking at it, as we saw the aircraft hit the tower up in New York. And so that was about 9 o'clock that morning. Excused myself from the room, went out to the nursing station, called over to the battalion. I said, "Hey, what do you need me to do?" They said, and this is where I am. They said, "Just finish up with what you're doing, finish the delivery, and then come over as soon as possible, as we're going into a planning sequence to deploy." And so I go back, and basically 2 hours later, she delivers about 11 o'clock, a beautiful girl that happened to be the only birth at Martin Army that day, as the post was locked down and other folks didn't make it there. And so went from there to the battalion. We started planned a number of different things for the initial invasion into Afghanistan. My portion was just looking at how best to provide medical support, and then went within a couple of weeks. October 19th, we were jumping into Afghanistan.
Yeah, I want to talk about the jump into Afghanistan, but I mean, I can't even imagine the emotions. I mean, I know the emotions of that day, 9/11, because I was in the military as well. I was actually over in Germany at the time, but, delivering a baby, knowing all this stuff is going on, like the emotions and just everything, kind of going through you is very kind of complicated day, I would suppose.
Well, I mean, definitely an honor to provide care to Rangers and to anybody in the military, but also an honor when they want you to work with their families.
Mhm.
And so emotions of just being very proud, most honored to assist in that is just very humbling that folks would ask me to do that. And so with Mrs. J and with many others through the years, I can't tell you how incredible it felt to have the respect, the honor of others, especially Rangers, to be permitted to do something like that. So it was my honor. But also with the jump, unfortunately, as we were doing that planning sequence, there were others that had reached the end of their pregnancies, and we had done some planning. So we initially did planning there at Fort Benning, and then we went up to Fort Bragg to do some more planning, and I missed the opportunity to help other Ranger wives during that sequence. But my priority was to be the battalion surgeon at the time and to provide my expertise for medical support. But I mean, it was a very interesting moment in history. Yes.
So, the first jump, and, this kind of leads into, some of the bulk of the conversation I want to have with you, sir, is the, setting up medical support in the early days and, some of the challenges, but then also how that was also an opportunity to really establish some amazing programs and systems that would carry the Ranger Regiment forward for the next 20 years. But I would love for you to, talk about the jump and, kind of what that planning looked like for medical support.
So I think a couple different things. We got to go back in history. Sorry, this is going to sound like a history lesson.
No, it's
But
good. That's what we're doing.
but a couple different things. So the last huge conflict, as you know, before this was Vietnam, and Vietnam ending in 1975. There were a lot of lessons to be learned from that conflict, but many of those lessons didn't occur until many years later. As a matter of fact, one of the most prevalent and prominent articles that occurred from data collected during Vietnam came out in 1984, which is 9 years after the conflict. And so, but the thing is, they didn't have computers like we have computers now. They didn't have the ability to amass data and collect data and prosecute that data back then. Yeah, but it was 9 years later, and so it's kind of hard to apply lessons learned in real time when it takes you that long to look at the data. But data by Ron Bellamy, Colonel Bellamy at that time, helped to support the direction for providing care. And then fast forward to Somalia and Rangers that fought in Somalia, and unfortunately there were casualties that were incurred there as well. With that, there were several medical folks that learned from that and took those lessons. I was in medical school at the time, but several of us that were very familiar and had prior careers looked at all that and kept apprised of everything that was going on in Somalia. We even had some of the casualties over to the medical school during a couple of events just to talk to them and to fellowship with them. But there were others that actually wrote some things down too. One of those was a guy by the name of Bob Mabry, who was working as a medic during Somalia for an adjacent unit that was working with Rangers. And then there was another guy by the name of Frank Butler, who was a Navy SEAL that was watching and learning from that and other things. And he ended up writing an article that came out in 1996 called Tactical Combat Casualty Care and Special Operations. And so several of us, so Chris Pappas and his senior medic at the time, Rob Miller, at 3rd Ranger Battalion, looked at those principles from TC3 or Tactical Combat Casualty Care and started initiating some of those things. General McChrystal was there at that time, and Mike Hall was there at that time. And so they started adopting things into POIs. Then I came in right after Chris and continued working with the senior medic Rob Miller as we continued to sort of propagate some of these POIs with respect to integrating it into the big four. And so physical training, marksmanship, small unit tactics, and medical training, since Stanley McChrystal made that a big priority for those big four. It helped us to integrate in TC3 and do what it was demanded of the or requested of the regiment in directing our efforts towards those big four. And so that created all these POIs. And with that, talked to a lot of the NCOs, and so that was key. And so both at the regiment level and battalion level. And so Master Montgomery was a senior medic at regiment at the time. He had come from 1st Ranger Battalion before that, and then Rob Miller was there at 3rd Ranger Battalion. And then there were many others from all the battalions and regiment that were involved, both medical and non-medical. And once again, especially the non-commissioned officers that helped to propagate this. Officers come and go from the regiment, and some of them are blessed to be able to stay a little bit longer. But it's the non-commissioned officers that drive all these initiatives and maintain all these initiatives and create standards. And so that happened. And my call was instrumental with all this as well. And that one of the things that I believed was that everybody had the opportunity to be a casualty, but they also had the opportunity to be a first responder, and my call believed that, and so he helped us with that. And he helped us with promoting documentation, and we did that during training, and that helped to once things occurred on 9/11 and forward, we had those training programs in place. We had documentation practices in place. And so it was a matter of just actually doing it, just like in training, to actually do it during combat. And I think that's one of the biggest takeaways for everything that we did, regardless of whether it's medical or anything else, was to do in training what you're going to do in combat. And that way it's seamless. It makes it happen, and you're efficient. So specifically as far as the details, so that's one as far as how to do the training, but the other part is operationally how to plan for different things, and that's where the senior combat arms NCOs and officers come into play. And that in the regiment, they're very, very good at contingency planning. And so yes, realize that all sorts of things can happen, and how to then be effective in kill or capture the enemy given all these contingencies. But in that same respect, we had to start thinking about how to save lives with every contingency, and so that was something that we had to integrate in. And I tell you, somebody who helped to do this earlier than that through the years was a guy by the name of Bill Donovan that came out of 1st Ranger Battalion, and he absolutely a legend for helping us understand and promote medical training in the regiment, as well as how to look at supporting operations. So I don't know if that answered your question. Do you have any additional questions?
Yeah, no, it did. I mean, you definitely, you covered a lot. And I think what's just amazing about it is it's something we constantly talk about, that we need to learn lessons from, previous history, previous conflicts, previous wars and everything else. But just the concerted effort that you guys made to pull from, Vietnam and Mogadishu and other conflicts that had happened, so that we could provide the best care and, save lives of Rangers, and how much effort actually went into that is pretty amazing.
Well, between Master Montgomery and I, we'd keep telling ourselves and reminding each other that lessons learned are not lessons learned unless you learn them. And so
right.
we told ourselves that for 20 years, and basically tried to keep to that mantra. I mean, it's very easy to write things down. It's very easy to sort of document these things, but for them to go on a shelf doesn't make it make much of an impact. You've got to integrate it into what you're doing, and then make sure that future generations understand how to be effective, how to be efficient, how to propagate and actually grow and be better. And so I'm hoping that many of the things that we've done for the last 20, 30 years, that others will just make it better. So I mean, it was right for our time, and we continue to sort of advance things as much as we can. But I am truly hoping that those that are at the regiment right now and in the future actually do better than us, and continue to grow and advance many of the niches that we have, not just in medical training, but in other areas as well.
Well, I want to talk about more of the research and how, you develop systems that would collect data. But, before we do, I'd just love for you to kind of talk about the first jump, and mentality going around the first jump and, kind of the actions of that day.
So we were limited early on in that we only had a dozen medics and a PA and a physician per battalion, so it really wasn't much. But one of the things that we had done before was, since we believed that anybody had the opportunity to be a first responder, we had propagated first responder training across the board. Those that were good first responders and had a desire, and we're talking about everybody in the regiment. So it's not, I mean, we're talking about infantrymen, we're talking about cooks, we're talking about pack clerks, we're talking about everybody. But once, if they had a propensity for medicine, we went and sent them back for EMT training back then. And I think now they call it advanced first responder training. And then some of those EMTBs that were non-medical EMTBs then went on to become EMTIs or intermediates, and some of them became paramedics even. And so it was incredible to see all these individuals grow up, and as they became more senior NCOs, they had medical knowledge that were equivalent to many medical providers that were out there. And so in essence, we needed that on 9/11, and we needed that on the initial missions, as we just didn't have enough medics to cover everything that we needed to do. And so as we went into the planning for that first jump in, we made sure that our CCP was comprised of all those EMTs. And then we also made sure that we had the medics strategically located on the jump, so that they were able to provide the care and amass different first responders in different areas to provide care where the point of injury that where things occurred, but then also bringing them back to the casualty collection points that we had. In addition to that, what we did was we had a physician from another unit, a surgical unit that was supporting us at the time, and we brought him in on that initial mission into it was Objective Rhino, that later became Camp Rhino, as the Marines came in on follow-on. But that physician helped to be that liaison, provide care on the objective, but then also be a liaison with the surgical team that was supporting us. And so it helped to sort of decrease time to capability. And I think that that's an important theme through the years, is that basically by training everybody to do first responder type stuff, all you're doing is you're decreasing the time from the injury to the capability. And time is extremely, extremely important. I mean, if you're doing hemorrhage control, which is big, you're saving red blood cells into the system, right? And so the earlier that you can put on a tourniquet, the earlier that you provide hemorrhage control, the less blood is being lost, the less hemorrhage is occurring outside of the body. And so that was very important. But the same kind of context as far as surgical support, wanting to decrease that time to the surgical support and that was there in place. And so it was important having that liaison. And so we amassed all that we could onto the objective. There was only 199 of us that went on that jump. But I think that we were able to provide a capability just in case some injuries did occur. And we did have a couple injuries, primarily orthopedic, that occurred on Objective Rhino. Unfortunately, on an adjacent company, we had a helicopter mishap that occurred. They had some small arms fire. They had a dynamic rollover and brownout conditions where the aircraft went down, and we unfortunately had two individuals that passed away, two Rangers, and those were the two that initial ones that passed away, Rangers that passed away in the conflict in Afghanistan. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it absolutely did. And I think you highlighted something that we haven't actually talked about on Legends. We talk about the medics and the amazing, how amazing they were, the medics and the PAs and everything else. But something that we don't talk about is the Ranger first responders that we started training, and how we made it, a priority to have EMT qualified people in every single squad. Which was great, enhance the capability, but the capabilities of those individuals as it expounded over time during the GWOT, they became phenomenal in their own right as well. And they were able to do a lot of amazing things until we got medics, that could make it to the casualty, or if we had a mass cal situation, they were able to really kind of treat folks and provide crucial care to those individuals.
Absolutely. No, Mike. So I just view myself as being a medical director and helping to
Okay.
provide evidence and guidelines to the medics and to the first responders in order for them to save lives. And so in many of the medical officers, whether they be physicians or PAs, even though we did provide point of injury care ourselves, we were more importantly, medical directors for the whole system. And so also in line with what Stanley McChrystal envisioned was a flattening of the organization. And so as you look at a flattening of the organization, as we provide the knowledge and the experiences across the regiment to others that are not necessarily medical, so non-medical providers, those first responders, they are the ones that are carrying that torch and providing that life-saving capability. And so that's a key way of looking at flattening of the organization. So once again, it all this and it started with what Sergeant Major Pallister had said, that I mean the only thing that we deserve, the only thing we're entitled to is good leadership, great leadership, and definitely I think that the Rangers do that. I think that many organizations do that in the military, but that is something that is key, very important, no matter what you're talking about, whether it's medical training or other types of training.
Well, and I think, something that you highlight when you talk about, outstanding leadership, and it's a demonstration of everything that you talked about is one, yeah, obviously taking your job seriously, but, coming up with ways to ensure that we're the best at our craft, and that we're looking at every historical documents, things that are happening in real time on the ground, so that we can get better and better and better. I think that's a key aspect of being a true professional, and not just in the medical field, but all fields. When we talk about Rangers is that they have a tendency to do that, to really do their research and investigation to make sure that they're doing everything that they could possibly do to produce the best result.
And I would agree. I would say that the foundation is just being a master of the basics.
Yeah.
And so I think what was key for McChrystal and saying, okay, here's the big four priority. It's not so associated with it, then you got to justify why you're doing something outside of the big four. But it helped to focus Rangers.
Yeah.
And so the same thing in medicine. And so we stuck with the basics and said, okay, we want everybody to master the basics across the board throughout the regiment. And once you do that, then you can add on to that, but you've got to master the basics. That's the foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just goes into the classic saying, if you don't set priorities, and you say everything's a priority, then nothing's a priority. And, General McChrystal, the big four, which eventually became the big five. And I'd make the argument that the big five is probably about as much as you want to do. But I've seen organizations that have, like their big 12 or big 15, and it's like, that's too much. You're laying out too many things and nothing's a priority, and you can't really be the master of those 4 tasks or 5 tasks.
And I would agree with you. And I was there when General LaCamera had added on the RCO at the time in 2005, had added on mobility as the 5th priority.
Yeah, and that was needed.
It definitely was. And so the other thing that, and so I looked at all the big 4, big 5 as, how do we play a role in it medically? And so physical training, okay, you can see how medical can fit into that. Okay, marksmanship, okay, once again, you can see how we can be a part of that too. And same thing with small unit tactics. And but you can also see it with mobility. And so, well, how do we do evac, and how do we improve on evacuation and different platforms and support of casualties? And so, yes, all of it applies. And so, yes, agree. But going more priorities dilutes the message. I would agree with you.
So since I have you on the podcast, and I've said this for a long time, but I guess I've never had like the medical expert on there to kind of
Yeah,
validate my thought process. When I would talk to my medics, or I would talk to, like platoon sergeants and everything else in the Ranger Regiment now, and I would ask them, hey, what's the first step of casualty care? And they would go into, assessing, all these different kind of things, or, pull to cover. And I would say, no, none of that matters. Prevent more casualties.
that
So
is correct.
that's the first thing that we need to do, because obviously we just took a casualty for a reason. Somebody's trying to kill us, so let's first make sure that we don't take any more casualties.
That's exactly right. And that can be returning fire. So that's
Exactly.
exactly right. Yes, and that's
Yes.
great medicine. Yes. So
Yes.
battle. Yes, and so it's that you got to have that superiority of fire. You're exactly right. Yes.
All right, everybody. So you heard it first. You heard it from the master doc. So, all right, I
Well,
appreciate it.
but you can look at it from the civilian side too, and so sometimes
Yeah.
it's scene security, right? And so and on the civilian side, you got to make sure that you're not going into a scene where you're going to cause further harm to those around you or to yourself, or become casualty, and then you become part of the issue. And so scene security is very, very important in combat. Sometimes that is fire superiority and returning fire, and so definitely so. I agree with you.
Man, I wish I would have talked to you earlier, because scene security. I wish I would have. Yeah, that would have been a better way of saying it. I love it. All right, so
Well, you said it perfectly. So yeah.
well, thank you, sir. I appreciate it. Post jump, and now we are going into extended operations, in Afghanistan. So prior to, kind of the invasion of Iraq, what was some of the things that you wanted to make sure that you looked into from the few casualties that we did take? We didn't necessarily know it was going to be a 20-year kind of conflict, but we knew very quickly, hey, we're going to at least be there for a little while. So what's some of the things that you looked at and tried to apply to increase, Ranger care?
So it goes back to what I was mentioning before, and that I'm just one individual. You're just one individual. And so how do you create, and you had mentioned it, systems. And so the issue is that I didn't want to depart the regiment, and some ideas depart with me. And so how do
That's
you
awesome.
integrate things into the regiment? And so once again, it's not just specific to medicine, it's for everything. And oftentimes NCOs would say, well, then usually it's going to become a system within the regiment. But what makes that survive are the NCOs once again. And so what I tried to do in subsequent years is integrate as much as I could into the system. And so this is both medical and non-medical non-commissioned officers that I knew that would propagate this into the future. And so if you'd ask who is key, who's key through the years, I would say it's those medics, and I would say that it was individuals like you that made it happen and continue to propagate those things in future years. One of the things that we were limited on early on is that we were focused more on trauma. And yes, if you're going into combat, trauma is very important. In that next rotation that we went on in 2002, in the summer of 2002, what we found out was that that medicine was equally as important, and preventive medicine was equally as important, as unfortunately we had a lot of Rangers come down with malaria. And that happened out in Asadabad and Shikin in Afghanistan, as we're setting up and establishing those
I
bases.
remember. I remember.
And so that was truly unfortunate that we had to learn it that way. But what I ended up doing was taking all that, writing it up, and publishing it as a reminder that that it's not history. It's not just the China, India, Burma theater. It's not Marauders that experienced that. But unfortunately, we had to relearn that. So we didn't actually learn that lesson. We unfortunately had many cases of malaria that and that was totally preventable. But also the other thing that you should look at is trauma, and trying to figure out what is preventable in that respect for trauma too. And so then that put me on a course for the next 20 years in thinking about injuries and survivability and preventability and death but it took many years, and still there's discussions in the medical community, but you've got to define terms. And so with injury survivability, that specifically became a term that in the military that we agreed upon, especially at the Joint Trauma System, that deals with ideal circumstances on what kind of treatment that can be provided, and also what kind of diagnostics we should explore through research in order to improve care and increase survivability for those injuries in the future. But then death preventability was things that dealt more, sure, it relied on whether or not somebody survived from their injuries, but also it relied on tactically what was done. And so tactics, techniques, and procedures were very, very important. And so looking at the context of what is actually preventable. And so I know that it sounds like a bunch of terms, medical terms, but it's not. It's basically you've got to define things so that you can figure out how to improve things. And so whether you call it process improvement, performance improvement, human performance, it doesn't matter what you call it. There are things you've got to do through time, and so you've got to have data in order to do that. And so going back to something that we worked with Sergeant Major Hall when he was the RSM, was that he made sure that as we developed these bleeder control kits for everybody, that everybody also had the means for documentation of care, and so that we could actually document things both during training and in combat. We also later on in 2005, also with General LaCamera, developed an AAR system, after action review or after action report, where it gave us a second opportunity coming off objectives to document what had happened as well. And so some of that were truly data points. Others were just pieces of information, but all of it helped to develop a picture that we could give to commanders to help drive their decision making. And that's what's most important. And so, as a matter of fact, with that, so you can look at the documentation as being sort of a tiered system of establishing what we're doing, refining the training that we have based off the documentation and what we're actually seeing. And so with that documentation, one, it was a Ranger casualty card, which became the TC3 card for the military, the basis for it. And then with the card, then also doing an AAR, which was a formal AAR, and then having both those pieces of documentation go into what's called a pre-hospital trauma registry that we developed at the Ranger Regiment, and that we then were able to amass and look at data in the aggregate. And so look at trends and provide those trends to the battalion commanders, company commanders, to the regimental commander, and saying, hey, this is what we're seeing. And we also integrated what we had for the casualty care and the TTPs and everything else that occurred on those objectives. We also then integrated that with the hospital care that was provided. And we got that to the Joint Trauma System in San Antonio. And we also combined it with the Armed Forces Medical Examiners Service data points, which was for autopsies. So any Ranger that had passed away, we obtained their autopsies and worked with the pathologist, forensic pathologist up at AFMES in order to then get a total picture that we could provide to the commanders. And so and all this was cost effective because it provided evidence to commanders on, hey, this is what's happening. These are the tools that we need in order to improve our care or to provide diagnostics so we can figure out what's going on. And so it helped to direct procurement. And my understanding through talking with multiple different Ranger officers and NCOs that were involved in the procurement process, they felt that was very important. Directed procurement relies on good evidence to say what's important for what we buy. And that makes you cost effective as an organization. Was that too much at one time?
No, it wasn't. It was awesome. You talked about, the comedy collection cards, and, a lot of what I've found, in the research, sitting down for this episode is, the data points, the research, collecting all this, in training and also in combat across the entire spectrum, not just Ranger Regiment, but, SOF and then conventional forces. What would you say was some of the key lessons that we learned that really changed Ranger medicine?
So you're saying from within the regiment or outside of the regiment, or
that we applied in regiment? How about that?
Okay, yep. So first thing that so TC3 or Tactical Combat Casualty Care and Special Operations was just an article back in 1996, and so somebody needed to validate that. And what I'd say is that the Ranger data helped to show that yes, it was the right direction to take. for pre-hospital casualty care. And so I'd say that that's one of the things that Rangers were hopeful in doing, not only for the Ranger community and directing our training, but for the military as a whole. And actually it propagated over to the civilian sector. And you can see that with a 2016 report from the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering and Medicine that talked about that. And actually, I mean, that's a national report that's talking about civilian and military medicine, but also mentions things that we looked at from the Ranger Regiment and saying that this was important. And so I'd say that the validation helped to validate and to steer and to guide at TC3 was part of what we did. There are other organizations that did the same thing, but at least we were part of that in history. And importantly, that we were regimented enough to be able to document a lot of that care. And that is another point that really hasn't happened as ubiquitously as it should, is the documentation of care. And so the Rangers showed that it could happen. And part of that was because we had great non-commissioned officers that made that happen, and there are repercussions if you didn't document. And so to give you an example, on the civilian side, if you don't document the care as a paramedic or an EMT, you can get fired. You know, they'll take your money away. But we don't have those same kind of things that apply to standards in the military. Okay, so you don't document care. You just say, oh, I was too busy. I was unable to do it. People were shooting at me. All that sort of stuff. You always have the ability to do it. Sometimes it's not in real time. Sometimes it's near real time. And so you got to do it a little bit later. But you have opportunities to document. The documentation is extremely important. It's not as exciting as providing the care. And most people don't see that as an important part of it, but I think with all the technology that we have, there's got to be ways that we can advance documentation of care and granularity of that care in the future.
Well, it just, it goes into exactly what you said. The point of a lesson learned is to learn something and to actually, collect the data so that we can be better going forward.
Yes. And so there was an article that we wrote. Well, actually, I mean, so if you go back through time, one of the great things about medical providers from the regiment is that they've gotten involved with publications so that we can document lessons learned through time. Bill Donovan did that. Other medical providers have done that and in time. And one article that came out in 2011, as we were doing a cursory look, our initial look at the data from the Ranger Regiment for all our casualties and fatalities, is that we were able to reduce preventable deaths as defined at the time. And the other thing that we saw as you look at some of those tables in that article was that, and one of the biggest things, and this was seen in multiple different articles, one specifically the Eastridge article that talked about hemorrhage being the #1 mechanism of death on the battlefield. But what we saw in the Ranger article was that we were very good at hemorrhage control, and it wasn't me, it wasn't the physicians, it wasn't PAs, it was first responders, it was non-medical first responders, and it was medics that were doing the bulk of the work, and that were actually saving lives through hemorrhage control. And that means early tourniquets, early pressure dressings, getting them surgical care as early as possible, decreasing time to capability. And so that we saw through the data points as well. Doesn't mean that other things aren't important, and we did look at other things like improving on pain management, and we did that through an analysis of we were one of the initial units to start using fentanyl lozenges and providing for pain management, and we did other things as well. But I would submit that for most lives, it's that controlling of hemorrhage. And so if hemorrhage is going to be the #1 mechanism of death on the battlefield, or a big component of it, then you've got to either control that hemorrhage or stop that hemorrhage, or stop the bleed, or give blood, or both. And that's what we got to do. Unfortunately, we still have limitations, and that we can do limb tourniquets or extremity tourniquets, and we can even do some junctional tourniquets. When I say junctional, what I mean is like where the arms and legs come into the body at that junction. But it's very, very difficult to control truncal hemorrhage or hemorrhage that's non-compressible. And I would submit that probably future research and future things that are done within special operations need to be directed towards helping to find ways to mitigate in a pre-hospital environment some of that that hemorrhage from truncal reasons. I do think that the regiment, once they became more masters of hemorrhage control, that they went off into a direction of becoming more masters of providing blood, and specifically looking at how best to do that through Ranger programs for providing blood. And I think that that's very important, but there's more to be done, and hopefully that can happen in the future.
You spurred a thought in my mind. I think it was around 2013 or 2014 when I was up at 275 and I was the NCOIC of the training cell. They wanted me to put together, and I didn't, do the details. I was just kind of the orchestrator of the entire display and, the rehearsals for it. But we had a huge delegation that came out, and I apologize, I don't remember who it was, but it was a bunch of civilians that came out, doctors and, trauma technicians and everything else came out, and the Ranger medics at 275 actually put on a demonstration of all the different things that we'd done in the medical field and advancements we'd done. And the big thing they were talking about is that in the 75th Ranger Regiment, when you talk about preventable deaths, we'd had a zero, I don't remember the percentage, but it was a very, very low percentage, especially compared to the civilian side of things, and that's what they were coming out there for, was to see how Rangers were doing things to prevent, for those preventable deaths. And I just remember the individuals, these are doctors, these are people that were, very well known in their fields. We're literally, taking notes, and asking just, questions that were way over my head at the time, and there was these young sergeants and staff sergeants that were, sitting there, answering these questions. And I was just blown away by the level of intelligence exchange there.
And so definitely a blessing through the years as far as the quality, the character of Ranger medics.
Yeah.
And that's regardless of which battalion. All battalions have contributed significantly through the years towards saving lives. And so that's the great thing about it, is that sure, you get 3 geographically separate line battalions, and with those battalions through the years, they have fed to each other. And well, actually, even with them, and I don't know if the special troops battalions what their status is right now and how much they've grown. They were growing a lot when I was there. I left the regiment a long time ago, but even with them and the companies that were there in the RSTB, they were propagating initiatives. I mean, everybody was propagating initiatives in the right direction for saving lives. And so there are so many can say about each battalion and what they've done to contribute, and so amazing. But once again, I think that what was important is that all of them had the appropriate foundation. They were all masters of the basics, and then they just sort of kept adding to what they felt was important and where their passion was towards medicine and towards being better Rangers. And so now I'm very proud. I mean, even it's more than a decade since I left the regiment. I left in 2010, and I remain proud. And it's been an honor to talk with Rangers and Ranger medics that are still there, and that have been there since I left. And so no, it's a great family, and it's wonderful that they've kept up a lot of the traditions of remaining passionate for saving lives.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I want to go back just a little bit, because you talk about your Ranger career, and that we've talked about the long path that it took you to actually get to the 75th Ranger Regiment, but then very quickly, within 2 years, you're jumping to Afghanistan. Then a year later, you're jumping into Iraq. What was kind of your thoughts, and what was that like, that, hey, you came to Ranger Regiment to serve with the best and to do these amazing things, and it doesn't always happen. You immediately got to do that stuff, as the surgeon for 375.
It was kind of interesting in that I know that we mentioned it before, and we talked about it a couple of times, in that how important training is. Yeah. And so everything in the early years before we started deploying to Afghanistan and Iraq, so while I was there from 99 to 2001, we were doing all these things. And we were doing them in different areas in the country as for training exercises, and even outside of the country. But we were doing it in a very realistic fashion. And so as we then went into Afghanistan, and as we went into Iraq, and as we're doing these these airfield seizures, and as we're doing these seizures of desert landing strips, and as we're conducting raids, and as we're conducting ambushes, as we're doing all these things, it was exactly like training. And so I don't think that I mean, in those early days, I mean, I do recall many folks, many Rangers saying exactly that hey, this was just like we did in training. I mean, yes, the stakes are a little bit higher, you know, as you've got an enemy force that you're up against, that are shooting at you, and things are live, but it was just like training. And I think that as we do things now and as we move into the future, it's got to remain so that that training is as close to combat as possible. Matter of fact, one of the things that we looked at and talked with Sergeant Miller at 3rd Ranger Battalion in the early days back 99, 2000, was that as we had human patient simulators, and as we were doing live tissue training, as we're doing all these things back then, is the training going to be too realistic where it's going to cause undue trauma or stress when individuals going through the training? And the thing is, if you can't do it in a controlled environment, then how are you going to expect folks to do it when it's real and it needs to happen? And so I think that if anything, it may have helped to understand what's going on before real world circumstances demanded your attentions on an objective in some foreign country.
Yeah. So what would you, when you kind of look at, you said that you were the director of medical services. So, you were selected to be the regimental surgeon, and going into that position, one, it's an honor, obviously, to be able to, be selected for that. But, what was kind of the mentality and the sense that you had, going into that position?
No, great question. And so, and I've got to back up a little bit. And so I ended up being at the 3rd Ranger Battalion from 99 to 2003. And
which is amazing within itself. 4 years, that's unbelievable.
Well, it was an honor to be there for those 4 years, and so it was non-traditional, as historically many physicians would stay only 2 years and go to the next assignment, and so it was very rare that individuals would have the opportunity to stay longer, and so I truly appreciate that I had that opportunity. And so I guess in saying that, yes, it took me a long time to get to the Ranger Regiment. Once I got there, I tried to stay as long as I could. And so when I left in 2003, I left for a second residency. And so my initial residency was in family medicine. My second residency was in aerospace medicine. And the reason why I went into aerospace medicine was a couple of different reasons. One, it came with a master's in public health that helped me and guided me through biostatistics and epidemiology. And then two, aerospace medicine helped me to understand how best to provide better care in the back of an aircraft. So whether that be fixed wing or rotor wing aircraft for our casualties. And so I did that for a couple of years. And so coming back then as the regimental surgeon in 2005 and staying through 2010, what I was able to do was sort of transition from just providing individual care on objectives and a little bit of population care to then a lot more population care as I understood what needed to be done. And so I think that's important. And I think that's what defines the difference between good and great care for organizations is doing both and providing individual care, great individual care, but then also understanding how to provide great population care. And that it takes a different mentality. It wasn't something that I initially that I looked at, but it was also in line with something eventually that I wanted to do, and that I love serving in small communities, and so rural kind of communities versus urban, and where you know folks, and basically the battalions and the regiment were exactly that. It was a small community. I mean, even though 3,000, 4,000, is the size of the regiment now, it's a small community, and getting to know them as part of your family is I think very important, not only for being effective on your missions and doing well as an organization and a team, but I think that there's a lot to be said about working as teams, not only in the medical sense, but across the board in other disciplines, but also in understanding the culture. And I think that I know that I mentioned earlier on that the regiment had a similar personality and character that I wanted to be affiliated with, and who was me. And so I'm glad that I felt like I fit there, and it helped me to fit there. And I think that that's what helps people to fit as Rangers within the organization, is because it fits who they are and who their character is. So.
You kind of just skipped over it, but you said that you were the regimental surgeon from 2005 to 2010. I mean, and I'm pausing for effect there. Those are the crazy, extremely volatile times in the GWOT. When we talk about the GWOT as a whole, that time period was when things they were very busy. And we lost a lot of Rangers, because every night there was a Ranger, element in a firefight somewhere, between the two countries. I mean, almost, I imagine it was probably almost every night, so that must have been a difficult time. While it was an honor, it was also a difficult time for you as well.
It is very difficult. And so as we talk about becoming more of a family as in the battalions and the regiments, especially in the companies and platoons, people get very, very close. It's very hard to take care of folks that you know. And so unlike, sure, I get to know folks in practice at the hospital and clinic, but it's different when you're eating, sleeping, working out, doing things with your colleagues, and then having to provide care for them. And so yes, it can become very difficult at times to do that. The other aspect of that is that which was helpful for me, was that from 2005 to 2010, there'd be occasions when we had PAs or physicians that had or openings, if you will, for those positions, and I had to fill some of those openings at other battalions. And so I had the opportunity to serve with 1st Ranger Battalion, 2nd Ranger Battalion, and 3rd Ranger Battalion downrange, and saw them and saw what they did. And I tell you, across the board, I mean, all phenomenal. And so all had mastered the basics in multiple different areas, all had different characters and different personalities. And you've probably seen that through the years, that the East Battalion does have a different personality, and each company has a different personality. But it was truly tremendous to have had the opportunity to do that. But I think you're exactly right. It's very hard. It's actually very hard for me today to talk about many of the casualties that occurred. And so, especially as I was providing individual care on objectives. So beyond just the Rangers and our and other colleagues that were with us on objectives, the other hard part about casualty care in both Afghanistan and Iraq, for me at least, was whenever children would get injured on objectives. And I don't know if you happen to be on any objectives when that happened, but unfortunately there were several, and unfortunately, it's just seeing innocent folks that were there on objectives, and through enemy fire or through fire that occurred on the objective, that unfortunately that some things occurred. And so just unfortunate to see that, and that was always a difficult moment.
Yeah, and I appreciate you being willing to talk about that, sir. But yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the most difficult nights of my life, involved, civilian casualties and children. That's
and I don't like to go into detail about it, and so I won't. But I just wanted to mention that is a very difficult thing. And so even in the future, and I wanted to mention it, it's just so the folks see that, okay, it's not just an enemy that gets hurt or that that is killed, but also unfortunately there are others that get hurt. So.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I agree. So, all right, well, pulling out of that, we'll take a steep climb out of that one.
Yes.
Your observations, now, years removed, and you're in the civilian world now, just kind of your overall observation of Ranger medicine and where it has gone. And I know you still, like you highlighted, you still have, touch points with the 75th and the community. What's kind of your, just overarching kind of observations of it all over the last 20 years?
So yes, I've known all the regimental surgeons since I left, and knew a couple of them before I got there. And so, which is interesting, that you know them through time. What's also interesting is that some of the younger enlisted and officers that I worked with long time ago, 20 years ago, are now senior NCOs and officers, and I've kept up with them through time, and they have lived the Ranger charters, and propagating the message and continuing to advance things. So all I can say, I mean, one word to sum it up is pride. I am so proud of having had the opportunity to be a Ranger and be with the Ranger Regiment for as long as I did, but also I'm so proud to see that Rangers continue to live up to the Ranger name and the Ranger creed. And so I don't know how to say that any better. I do think that, I mean, for me, one of the reasons why I went to the Ranger Regiment and went in the military, and then one of the reasons why I went into medicine was to serve others. And in both those professions, I'm serving others. And whether it's Colonel Puckett, or whether it's General Rudder, or whether it's any other Ranger through time, you see selfless service. This is on behalf of something that's a greater good. And so no, what I see a sense of left is I'm just proud that they continue to do things, and they continue to do it to the best of their abilities. And so I'm just proud. Thank you.
No, absolutely. So what, you talk about all your service within the Ranger Regiment, and, you had some amazing years that you were part of it. What does the overall brotherhood just kind of mean to you even now?
It's an extended family, and there are individuals that I keep up with to today. And so there's a nonprofit organization that I worked with and still in contact with. It's called Darby's Warrior Support. That's up in Arkansas.
Yep.
Where Rangers and other special operations and other folks who were wounded warriors will go up and do duck hunting up in Arkansas. And so work with a group of guys there that are absolutely phenomenal. And so Sean Daniel is actually in charge of that group, and has done amazing things to propagate it and afford opportunities, not just for duck hunting, but other types of hunting throughout the year. All the individuals that I've worked with through that organization, and then even here locally, I'm in Bryan College Station, which is out in the middle of nowhere here in Texas. And there are Rangers here, and I've fellowshipped with Rangers that are in the local area as well as in Texas. There are Rangers spread out throughout the nation, throughout the world, that I've kept up with. Interesting enough that I'll have that I haven't heard from in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, that will reach out. One of the things that I mentioned when I was in the Ranger Regiment is that I would give out my phone number, my cell phone number, and my email address. And I told folks that once both of these change, then I'm too old. And so, but I've kept them both. And so I've had the same email address and the same phone number since the 90s. And so those who have kept those points of contact have been able to reach me. And it's an honor to talk with them 10, 15, 20 years. Sometimes it's about medical issues. Other times it's just they're reaching out to talk to somebody else.
Yep.
And so, yes, that fellowship remains, and it's like an extended family. So just an honor to be part of it.
All right. So the final question, well, second to last question that I just am absolutely fascinated to ask. If you could stand in front of all Rangers, past, present, and future, yes, we have some time machine or something like that we can make this happen, what would you say to them, sir?
So I guess what part of it is just being true to yourself and true to your and being a person of character. And so just like the Big Four, Big Five, and the Ranger Regiment, I mean, everybody has that for themselves as individuals. And although we go to the left and right, it's maintaining that. And so one of the things as I've grown through the years is trying to maintain those basics within myself. And what I would submit is that Rangers do that too. Some of them realize it, and some of them have yet to realize it, but they do it. And so for me, those big priorities within myself is my faith, my family, my friends, and believe it or not, the way I term it is, so it's an F as well, is that sort of a fellowship of for freedom, on behalf of freedom. And so it sounds kind of corny, sounds kind of basic.
I don't think it sounds corny at all.
But that is what I'd submit that I'd give to current Rangers and future Rangers, and actually even folks that aren't Rangers, that be true to yourself and be a person of character. Yes, I mean, life is difficult, and I think that is one of the things that's been very hard for me through the years. Is that it's not just that I sacrifice things in my life in order to do things on behalf of the Rangers in the Ranger Regiment and in the military, but my family also sacrificed, and so I'm not sure that that some years I was well in balance, as maybe my family might have suffered more than I wanted them to, and they did, is trying to get back into balance as frequently as possible, and so that's what I would submit for all Rangers.
I like that you talked about balance and the sacrifices, and there's this thing that goes around, and Army leaders will talk about it and they'll say, you need to maintain perfect life balance. And I've said it multiple times and I'll say it again on this podcast. It's bullshit. There's not going to be, if you're going to be dedicated to your profession, there's never going to be a perfect balance. It's just not going to happen. Instead, what you need to learn to do is communicate about sacrifices that you're willing to make, and getting everybody on board and communicating them to your family or to your job or whatever it's going to be. Instead, it needs to be about communication and helping everybody understand what you're doing and why you're doing it.
Well, I mean, so you take that and you look at the Ranger Creed and it says you got to do it 100% and then some.
Yeah.
Well,
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. If you're multitasking, what you're doing is you're doing multiple things at less than 100%.
I love it, sir. Yeah, absolutely. You're spot on.
Yeah.
Well, sir, as we kind of get ready to close out here, because surprisingly, I cannot believe how quick this has went. We are pounding on the door of an hour and a half. What
Sir,
would you?
Major, it's been an honor to talk with you. So thank you. Thank you for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for coming on and just giving us a ton of education. And I mean, there's just so many things about this episode that I just love. But in kind of closing, before I close this out, two things. Anything else you just kind of want to say or you want to cover, and then just how can people get a hold of you if they want to reach out to you, in some way or some fashion, or just to tell you thank you, maybe.
No, and thank you for saying that. And so we're partly where I ended up after retiring from the military is with the Joint Trauma System. The Joint Trauma System is a Department of Defense entity that tries to do great things in multiple different areas, both pre-hospital care and hospital care. And for trauma care that's specific to combat, as well as trauma care that can transcend the military and go to the civilian sector. And so I'm still at the Joint Trauma System. And so I'd submit that if folks need to get a hold of me, I'm available on the, if you're in the military, I'm available on the global as I do some consulting work for the trauma system. And so the other thing I'd say is that as Rangers propagate in initiatives into the future, to be sure that if it's medically related, to talk with folks at the Joint Trauma System and continue to talk with the Joint Trauma System, so that it's done on not only on behalf of the Ranger Regiment, but propagates across the Department of Defense and then into the civilian sector. And so that's one of the last things that I would say. And so getting a hold of me easy through that means. But otherwise, there are many folks that are out there that have my number and have my email, and so ask around, and we're welcome to talk to Rangers in the future. So, yes.
Well, I appreciate you, sir, and I appreciate all the discussion and you coming on Legends and just bestowing a ton of knowledge on us and history. I mean, man, there's just, like I said, there's a ton of things to unpack there.
Oh, so sorry, Major, I thank you for doing this. I mean, so what I believe, and I've said this several times, is that history is written by those who write. You think that, okay, people of action, they're the ones that actually do it. But the thing is, if they don't document what they're doing in time and make it part of history, then it's not going to be there. And so you're documenting Ranger history by doing this. And boy, I can't even fathom how much of an impact you're going to have on future generations. So thank you for doing this.
That's probably the greatest thing anybody's ever said to me about this, sir. I got to be honest with you. Maybe it's just the history side of me. I love history and I love to talk about it. Well, fuck, just thank you, sir. Thank you for saying that. I really do. I from the bottom of my heart, I really appreciate that.
And I look forward to talking with you again. So you've got my contact information. If people reach out to you and want to get a hold of me, then please do give that to them. But I look forward to talking again. Hopefully this is not the last time I hear from you.
No, it won't.
I'll hear from you again.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thank you for coming on the show today, sir. I know everybody's going to love hearing from you and catching up with you. And everybody else, thank you for tuning into the Legend of the 75th. Please share this episode so we can make sure all of our Ranger buddies know about it. Rangers, lead the way.